January 1st, 1863. In Washington City, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect that day. Yet on a stretch of worn ground in northern Texas, Grant Johnson still rose in the dark to work under orders he did not give and could not refuse. The news printed in distant papers named freedom for enslaved people in rebel states, but no rider reached his quarters with a paper in hand, and no white overseer in his world announced any change. Grant Johnson had been born in bondage in the northern reaches of Texas in the 1850s, the son of Alex Johnson, a Chickasaw freedman from Missouri, and Miley Johnson, a Creek freedwoman from Mississippi. The adults in the quarters spoke of the Red River and the lands beyond it, where Chickasaw and Creek families had been pushed west and where their kin still lived. The boy heard names of towns and tribal districts more often than the name of the county where he actually slept, because his parents talked of Indian Territory as a place that still held a measure of their own law. The small cabin that held the Johnson family sat near fields that rolled with cotton rows and patches of corn and sorghum. In summer, the air stayed thick with dust and heat long after the sun dropped, and in winter, northers cut through cracks in the plank walls. Grant slept on a mat close to the packed dirt floor and woke each day to the scrape of his father's boots and the dull clank of tools as Alex shouldered a hoe or lifted harness for the mules. The boy learned early that work began before there was enough light to see the lines of the rows. The adults who controlled the land treated the people they owned as part of the farm's equipment. Tasks changed with seasons, but the pattern remained fixed. When he was small, Grant carried water and kindling, walked behind his mother as she balanced heavy baskets, and picked worms from plants under a sun that burned the back of his neck. As he grew stronger, he took hold of the rough wooden handles of a plow, feeling the resistance of hard ground through his arms while Alex guided the mule and watched for any sign that the boy might stumble. Conversation on the place moved between English, Creek, and traces of Chickasaw. In the quarters, Miley used Muskogee words when she wanted to speak privately to Alex or to older neighbors, and Grant listened closely until the syllables carried meaning for him. English reached his ears through orders, threats, and snatches of talk between white men discussing prices, war news, and distant markets. By the time he reached his early teens, he could understand clear speech in both tongues and follow enough Chickasaw phrases to know when older people whispered regarding plans they did not want overheard. The Civil War years tightened the strain on everyone living on that patch of ground. Men who claimed ownership of Grant and his parents rode away with rifles and faded gray cloth stitched to their shirts, leaving younger or older relatives to manage the place. Wagons passed more often, some loaded with bales and some with uniforms and crates of food for soldiers. Rumors regarding battles in Arkansas and along the Mississippi drifted through the quarters at night, delivered by field hands who had walked from neighboring farms or by teamsters who stopped at the well and lowered their voices as they talked. For enslaved families, the war altered routines without erasing the old punishments. Workdays stretched longer because there were fewer white men left to oversee every task, and any sign of resistance brought fast violence from those who remained. Grant saw men and women return from the big house or the fields with cuts across their backs, and he knew that his best defense lay in quiet strength rather than open challenge. He watched closely, obeyed quickly, and saved his questions for his parents when the cabin door closed behind them at night. Inside that cramped room, Alex and Miley tried to give their son tools that did not fit in a wagon and could not be taken away by a sail. Alex spoke of his own life under Chickasaw masters and of the march that had moved native families west from Mississippi and Alabama long before Grant was born. Miley talked about Creek towns where councils met in square grounds and where speakers addressed the people in Muskogee without needing a translator. They described relatives who had gone to Indian Territory and the complicated way freedom and bondage mixed there for black people tied to the tribes. Grant learned that some black families in the nations held land or worked as interpreters and teamsters. Others remained tied to native slaveholders and faced the same threats as those who lived under white owners in Texas. To a boy hearing these stories by lamplight, the important point was clear. There were places not far to the north where his parents' languages carried weight in council houses and where black men linked to Chickasaw and Creek communities sometimes moved with more freedom than any adult he saw on his own place. As the war dragged from one year to the next, the fields around the Johnson cabin did not go quiet. Cotton still had to be planted and picked, and corn had to be hoed, yet shortages touched the farm all the same. Cloth grew scarce. Shoes wore out without being replaced, and coffee disappeared from the big house except on rare days when someone returned from town with a parcel. The white family that owned the land worried regarding bandits and deserters as much as they worried regarding Union troops. Grant heard them talk regarding patrols and outlaws and watched them keep weapons near the door at night. Those fears shaped the way they treated the people they controlled. Patrol riders moved along the roads more often and questioned anyone who walked too far from the fields. Permission slips passed from one hand to another whenever a black person needed to travel even a short distance to another farm. The boy knew that being caught without such a paper could mean a whipping or worse. That knowledge made every step outside the lines of the rows a risk, and it taught him to think carefully before he moved. A habit that would later keep him alive on long rides through more open country. News of federal victories added a sharper edge to white anxiety. Talk of Vicksburg, Shiloh, and distant Virginia spread through the quarters, along with stories of men deserting the Confederate ranks and slipping back into Texas. At night, older hands argued quietly regarding what would happen if Union troops reached their county. Some believed the soldiers would enforce freedom and protect them. Others believed another set of men with guns would make demands and then move on, leaving owners behind to punish anyone who looked too hopeful. Grant listened to every side and stored each version of the future in his memory. When word of the Emancipation Proclamation filtered into North Texas, it did not arrive with official seals or soldiers carrying orders. It came in fragments carried by drovers, by enslaved men who had been hired out to work on roads, and by newspaper clippings read in secret by the few who had learned their letters. The broad promise of freedom boiled down to something simple for Grant and his parents. The government far away had named them free on paper, but the local men who held power refused to act as though anything had changed. Violence followed any hint that people in the quarters might try to claim that paper promise. On one nearby place, word spread that a group of enslaved men had spoken loudly regarding leaving if Union troops came within reach. The response from their owner was swift. He gathered them in the yard under the hot sun and made an example of the man he thought most outspoken, beating him until he could not stand. Such stories moved rapidly between farms and reminded everyone around Grant that change might come, but it would not come gently. Through it all, Alex Johnson kept his focus on survival. He worked the fields, fixed tools, and did what was required in front of the white family while reserving his true thoughts for late hours with Miley and their son. Grant saw that his father refused to break, even on days when the overseer shouted in his face or threatened him with the whip. That quiet refusal made a deep mark on the boy. He learned that strength did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it showed in how a man held his shoulders after punishment, or how he met the eyes of someone who tried to humiliate him. Miley guarded what she could of family life. She patched clothes until cloth turned thin, found extra food when possible, and made sure Grant ate enough to keep up with the work demanded of him. She also protected small pieces of Creek tradition. On certain evenings, she hummed old songs in Muskogee or told stories that had survived removal and bondage. She named clans, towns, and rivers he had never seen but might visit someday. In those, Moments the cabin felt less confining and more a connection to a world larger than the narrow strip of Texas soil where they lived. The end of the war reached northern Texas slowly. Months passed between the surrender of Confederate forces and the day Union authority finally made itself felt. When ordered freedom arrived, it carried the power of federal troops and the backing of new laws, yet it did not erase the years that had shaped Grant's early life. Former owners pressed freed people into labor contracts that closely resembled the old arrangements, and many white Texans expected black workers to stay in place with little change in wages or treatment. Alex and Miley viewed the new terms differently. They understood that the legal chain had been broken even if many men around them acted as if nothing important had changed. Freedmen's bureau agents and traveling preachers spoke of wages, schools, and the possibility of land. Stories out of Indian Territory told of Creek and Chickasaw communities where black families tied to the tribes negotiated their status in ways that did not exist in Texas. The Johnsons began to discuss whether remaining on the same patch of ground made sense for a family with ties to those nations across the Red River. During those first years after emancipation, Grant took on more responsibility for his own work and for decisions that shaped his days. He hired out as a hand on neighboring farms when he could, moving under written contracts rather than sale papers. He followed cattle along dusty tracks that stretched toward river crossings and watched the way older men handled stock, argued over pay, and kept an eye on armed riders who might think nothing of robbing a crew of black drovers. Hard labor on the open range hardened his body and sharpened his sense of distance and direction. Language remained one of his most valuable tools. In camps near the river, he met Creek and Chickasaw men who spoke Muskogee, or related tongues more freely than his parents had dared use under slavery. Grant answered them in their own language and listened to discussions regarding conditions in the nations. He heard how Creek freedmen struggled with questions of citizenship, land allotment, and relations with white intruders. He also heard that some families with mixed black and native heritage had carved out roles as interpreters, law officers, and guides because they could bridge cultural gaps. These talks pushed the Johnson family's private debates along. Remaining in Texas meant living under a state government increasingly controlled by men who resented federal interference and aimed to restore their own version of order. Moving north into the Creek Nation meant entering a different legal and social system that still wrestled with its own divisions, but recognized the history behind Alex and Miley's status as Creek and Chickasaw freed people. For Grant, the choice involved more than law. It involved where his skills in language, tracking, and quiet observation might matter most. By the late 1860s, pressure on freed families in Texas grew more intense. Night riders harassed black communities and new state laws restricted movement and labor in ways that echoed older slave codes. Local authorities often sided with white landowners when disputes arose, making it clear that formal freedom offered little protection without power to enforce it. Reports from Indian Territory described a place that was no safe haven, yet still offered openings for someone with tribal ties, strong nerves, and a willingness to work hard along rough frontiers. In that climate, the Johnsons prepared to leave the land that had bound them for so many years. They saved money from wages, gathered information from travelers, and weighed which route toward the nations made the most sense. Grant, now a young man rather than a child, took part in these decisions instead of merely listening. The years of war, forced labor, and uneasy freedom had left him lean, strong, and used to long days in the saddle or on foot. He knew the look of men who carried violence inside them and the signs that trouble was coming long before a shot was fired. When the family finally stepped away from the place where Grant had first opened his eyes, they did so without fanfare. There was no farewell from former owners and no ceremony at the gate. They left traces of their years in the fields, the cabin, and the worn path to the well. but they carried something more important with them. Grant brought forward a body hardened by labor, a mind trained to notice detail, and a deep familiarity with fear and threat that did not paralyze him. Those traits traveled with him toward the border of Indian Territory, and toward a future in which he would no longer work under orders backed only by a whip, but would someday carry authority backed by federal law. June 14th, 1866. On that day, Creek leaders and United States officials signed a treaty that abolished slavery in the Creek Nation and promised full citizenship to Creek freedmen and their descendants. That agreement, written far from the Texas fields where Grant Johnson had grown up in bondage, created a legal opening that changed the map for families whose lives were tied to both African and Creek ancestry. The treaty said in plain language that people like his mother, a Creek freedwoman, had a defined place in the nation north of the Red River. In the years that followed, news of those terms moved along the same routes that carried cattle, mail, and rumors. Drivers who worked the Texas road and traders who passed through Indian Territory talked regarding land councils and the conditions facing Creek freedmen. When the Johnson family left the North Texas farm that had held them in bondage, they traveled into a region shaped by that treaty. Grant reached Indian Territory as a young man with a childhood behind him in Texas and a future tied to a nation where his Creek blood and freedman status both carried weight. The ground he entered had its own long history. The Creek people had already endured removal from their southeastern homelands, established new towns along the Canadian and North Canadian rivers, and rebuilt council houses and square grounds. North Fork Town, a key Creek settlement east of where Eufaula would stand, served as a religious and political center before the Civil War. Creek freedmen lived in and around such towns as citizens, though social lines still existed, and the scars of removal and war sat close to the surface for every family in that country. By the early 1870s, a steel line began to change that landscape. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway pushed south following the old Texas Road, and in 1872 the company established a railhead at a site near North Fork Town. That move shifted the center of local life. Businesses and homes from North Fork Town relocated toward the tracks, and the new town of Eufaula emerged beside the railroad. Freight, passengers, and mail now came and went on a schedule that linked Creek settlements to Kansas, Missouri, and Texas. When Grant Johnson settled in the Creek Nation during the decade from 1880 to 1890, Eufaula already functioned as a growing town tied to the rail line. The place lay within the Creek Nation, yet constant train traffic and trading activity brought in white merchants, black laborers, and native families from different districts. Wagons lined the dirt streets near the depot, and frame buildings rose beside older log structures. The mix of languages in town included English, Muskogee, and other tribal tongues, and a man who understood more than one language could move through several worlds without leaving the main street. Johnson belonged to that group. Born to a Chickasaw freedman father and a Creek freedwoman mother, he had grown up hearing and speaking Muskogee along with English. By adulthood, he spoke Muskogee fluently and wrote English well, with court records later showing a clear, careful hand and steady signature. In the Creek Nation, those skills mattered. Tribal officials, federal agents, and business owners all needed men who could interpret words and customs between black, native, and white residents. Johnson's ability to listen in one language and answer in another marked him as someone who could be trusted with work that crossed those lines. Life for Creek freedmen in that era mixed opportunity with constant pressure. The 1866 treaty recognized their citizenship, yet power struggles within the nation, and outside federal policies never stayed still. Freedmen farmed allotted or community land, raised stock, and built churches and schools, all while watching debates regarding land ownership and the arrival of outside railroads. Eufaula reflected those tensions. Creek families and freedmen lived around the town, while white merchants and professionals gathered near the depot. Each group brought its own expectations regarding law, order, and respect. In that environment, Johnson developed a reputation as a steady man who did not seek attention, yet did not step aside from responsibility. Neighbors in and around Eufaula later remembered him as reserved in manner, not noisy in public gatherings and careful in his dealings with people from every background. He had lived under slavery in Texas and knew exactly how fragile peace could be when men with power grew angry. That memory shaped his bearing. He rarely wasted words, and when he spoke, his statements carried more weight because people knew he chose them carefully. The work that filled his days in the Creek Nation connected him to the land and to the web of trails that crossed it. The country around Eufaula held timbered ridges, river bottoms, and prairie openings where cattle grazed. Roads linked Eufaula with Muskogee, Chakotah, and smaller settlements scattered through the creek districts. Johnson traveled those routes on horseback, learning the bends in each creek, the fords that held even after heavy rain, and the places where a rider could leave the main track and cut across country without losing direction. That familiarity with ground later served him in law enforcement, but it began with simple daily movement between farms, towns, and trading points. The mix of cultures in the Creek Nation required constant negotiation. Creek citizens debated how to balance traditional authority with the demands of federal officials and the pressure of incoming settlers. Black residents, including Creek freedmen, watched those debates closely because changes in land policy and court jurisdiction reached directly into their lives. Johnson's background and language skill placed him in the middle of those crosscurrents. He understood Creek custom through his mother's line, the experience of black freedmen through his own early life, and federal expectations through contact with agents and traders. This combination of experience and skills drew attention from men who needed reliable help in maintaining order. Federal marshals working out of Fort Smith and later courts inside Indian Territory looked for deputies who could move among Creek citizens and freedmen without misunderstanding. Such law officers needed to read and write English for warrants and reports, understand local languages for questioning witnesses, and track suspects through rough country with little support. Johnson met those requirements. His fluency in Muskogee, his clear English writing, and his knowledge of Creek lands made him part of a small group of black and native men considered suitable for commissions as Deputy United States Marshals. At the same time, local people in and around Eufaula relied on him in less formal ways. Disputes over fences, stock, and debts often flared where cultures and economies met, and not every conflict justified a journey to a distant federal court. A man known for careful judgment could ease tensions before they turned violent by carrying messages, explaining each side's view, or simply standing present when tempers rose. Johnson's quiet manner and reputation for fairness suited such roles. When he rode into a yard or stepped into a store, his presence alone signaled that someone with a clear head had arrived. Newspapers and official documents from this period mention Johnson only indirectly, yet the later record of his service shows that, by the late 1880s, key figures at Fort Smith and within the Creek Nation already knew his name. Judge Isaac Parker would later call him one of the best deputies to work for his court, a judgment that did not emerge from a stranger. Before any formal commission reached his hands, Johnson had already proven that he understood how to move through Indian Territory without stirring unnecessary trouble while staying alert to real threats. That combination of caution and firmness defined his role as a quiet leader long before a badge hung from his vest. By the end of the 1880s, the town of Eufaula held a few hundred residents, with Creek, black and white families all within reach of one another. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas trains still came and went, bringing news, goods, and occasionally trouble. The Creek Nation faced continuing disputes regarding land and authority, and federal courts increased their reach across Indian Territory. In the middle of that shifting ground, Grant Johnson stood as a Creek freedman whose life now centered on Eufaula, a man recognized for his language skills, his calm bearing, and his knowledge of the country. The next step, from respected local figure to federal lawman, followed naturally from the work he was already doing in one of the most contested regions of the frontier. 1887 to early 1890s. The wind coming off the Arkansas River carried the smell of wet timber and coal smoke when Grant Johnson first rode up to the high bluff at Fort Smith in the late 1880s. Below the stone walls, the river rolled past in a dull brown sheet, a moving border between Arkansas and the land where he had grown up among Creek families. Above him, the old military post had become a place where federal law tried to reach into Indian territory. Gallows timbers stood inside the stockade, and the sight of them told every man walking through the gate what failure looked like. Grant dismounted, patted the neck of his dark bay horse, and handed the reins to a stable boy. He walked past wagons loaded with shackled prisoners, men in chains who had been dragged in from Choctaw, Cherokee, and Creek lands. Some cursed in English, some muttered in their own languages. He understood more of those words than any white deputy on the yard. That was one reason the marshal's office had asked him to come. He had grown up among Muskogee speakers, had traveled the back trails as a scout and interpreter, and he knew the country that Judge Isaac Parker's deputies had to ride. Inside the courthouse, the wooden benches creaked as townspeople shifted and whispered while Parker's booming voice rolled out over the room. Grant watched from the back, still wearing the trail dust of Eufaula on his boots. He studied how Parker questioned witnesses, how defendants looked when they heard a sentence that would take them either to prison or to the gallows in the yard. The work of the court was harsh, but the men who brought prisoners in from Indian territory saw worse things in the brush and creek bottoms long before any verdict. Grant understood that. He had seen bodies left in thickets after whiskey fights, and families who did not dare step into town because a wanted man watched the road. When the clerk finally called his name, he stepped forward. The United States Marshal for the Western District, acting for Parker's court, explained the terms. As a deputy United States Marshal, Grant would ride under federal authority into Indian territory to execute warrants, subdue fugitives, and escort prisoners back to Fort Smith. He would be paid in fees and mileage, not a salary, so every arrest meant money earned but also another chance to be killed on the trail. No one pretended it was fair pay for the risk. Many deputy marshals who took the badge never lived long enough to grow old in the job. Grant listened without interrupting. He already knew the odds. He also knew that men in Creek Nation trusted him in a way they never would trust a white stranger. When the oath was offered, he raised his right hand and repeated the words slowly, careful with each phrase. He promised to support the Constitution and to faithfully execute the duties of a deputy United States Marshal. When it was done, he lowered his hand and felt the small weight of the tin star in his palm. The badge did not change who he was, but it tied his life to the law in a way that could not easily be undone. In the yard, another deputy waited, a taller man with a weathered face and a preacher's calm voice. Bass Reeves had already made a name for himself across Indian territory. He had survived gunfights, hauled in murderers who thought they could hide under the protection of tribal lines, and worn out more horses than most men ever rode. Reeves greeted Grant with a short nod and a handshake that said more than any words. Both men knew what it meant to work for a court that hanged men when the warrants were carried out. They also knew what it meant to be black in a land where many still saw that as a mark against them. Their first long ride together began before daylight. They left Fort Smith as the sky turned from black to a flat gray, and the lamps along Garrison Avenue faded. Reeves led the way toward the ferry, and the two horses stepped onto the wooden deck while the boatman pushed off. The river slid past underneath as the bluff receded. On the far side lay a maze of creek crossings, rocky ridges, blackjack thickets, small farms, and scattered villages where fugitives could disappear into kin networks and language barriers. Grant looked upriver toward the country that had shaped him and felt the strange mix of familiarity and new duty. Once they reached Indian territory, the tempo of work changed. There were no paved streets or steady town clocks. Time was measured in miles, campfires, and how long a trail stayed visible after a rain. Reeves showed Grant how he arranged his papers, keeping warrants folded in an oilskin packet to protect them from weather and sweat. Each name was linked to a place, a crime, and witnesses who might be yards apart or days apart by horseback. Grant added his own methods. He kept small notes in careful handwriting marking which families spoke English, who preferred Muskogee, and who would talk only if spoken to in their own tongue first. They slept wherever they could. Sometimes they spread blankets under a blackjack oak and used saddles as pillows. Other times they took a corner of a cabin with hounds pawing the dirt outside and children peeking around door frames to stare at the badges on their vests. On nights when frost formed on the grass, they leaned close to the coals and took turns rolling up in blankets so at least one man stayed awake to listen for hooves or footsteps in the dark. Grant did not complain. He had grown up with little and knew how to stretch a ration of flour and bacon. What mattered was that they kept moving, following every lead until it either turned cold or ended with a prisoner in irons. The territory they covered was hard on men and horses. Wagon roads turned into mud ruts after heavy rain, and steep ravines forced them to dismount and lead their mounts over slippery rock. In some districts, Cherokee or Creek light horse police rode the same country, handling tribal matters, while federal deputies like Reeves and Johnson focused on cases that fell under federal jurisdiction. That meant murder, major theft, whiskey running, and crimes that crossed tribal boundaries. They had to know where one authority ended and another began. But out on the trail, the only real boundaries were who had the power and the nerve to enforce an arrest. Grant's manner with people gave him an advantage that few deputies could match. When they rode into a Creek settlement to serve papers, he greeted elders in Muskogee and listened while they talked out their concerns. He did not rush them. Parents who hesitated to let a son answer a summons sometimes changed their minds after hearing him explain what would happen if the man tried to run. He did not pretend that the court at Fort Smith was gentle, but he laid out the truth plainly. A man who came in quietly had a chance to tell his side. A man dragged in after a chase might meet the gallows. Over time, word spread that this deputy would not trick people with promises he could not keep. Yet there were many times when someone chose to resist. In those moments, the quiet patience that marked much of Grant's work turned into a different kind of resolve. Once Reeves and Johnson found a wanted man holed up in a log house at the edge of a small settlement. The warrant named a murderer who had already dodged more than one officer. Women and children watched from behind trees while the deputies dismounted and walked up to the door. Grant called out in Muskogee, offering a chance to surrender. The reply came back in English and Creole curses, followed by the thud of a barred door. Reeves moved to one side of the doorway and Grant stepped to the other, both with revolvers loose in their holsters. They gave the man another chance. When he fired through a gap in the logs, splintering wood where Reeves had stood moments before, Grant answered with his own weapon. He did not shoot to frighten. He aimed low, into the wall just beside the opening, where a man looking out would be forced to flinch away. The shot blasted chips into the room. After a tense pause, they heard the rattle of a dropped gun. When the door finally opened, the outlaw stepped out shaking, eyes down, and Grant clapped irons on his wrists with no more words. That kind of scene repeated itself in different forms across the late 1880s. Sometimes resistance ended with a bruising fistfight in a muddy yard, other times with a sudden surrender when an outlaw saw two armed men who did not back away from danger. Each time, Grant added another name to his ledger and another trip to Fort Smith. In the records of Parker's court, his signature appears on complaints, affidavits, and return papers, each one written in a neat hand that set his work apart from deputies who could barely scrawl their names. For a man who began life in bondage, the sight of his own handwriting on federal documents carried a quiet meaning. It was proof that years of listening, reading, and translating had not been wasted. Working with Reeves shaped Grant's approach to the job. Reeves had a gift for disguises and ruses when a case called for it, arriving at a cabin as a tramp or a farmer, chatting his way inside before revealing the badge at a moment of advantage. Grant learned when to go along with such plans and when to insist on a more direct approach. There were places and families where trickery might make future work impossible. In Creek towns where people already knew his face, he found it better to ride in plainly, call a man out, and let everyone see that he relied on nerve and preparation instead of costumes. The two men balanced each other. Reeves pushed hard on long trails that crossed tribal borders, following suspects toward Choctaw country or north toward Cherokee settlements. Grant anchored their work in the Creek Nation, drawing on local guides, kin networks, and his deep knowledge of back routes. Around campfires, the older man shared stories of narrow escapes and long chases, while the younger deputy smoked cigars and listened. When he did speak, it was usually to narrow the focus back to the job at hand. He wanted names, places, and routes fixed in his mind before they moved. By 1890, the lawless reputation of parts of Indian Territory had only grown. Railroads cut through the land, carrying cattle, freight, and passengers, but also providing an easy path for gamblers, whiskey peddlers, and outright killers. Small towns sprang up along the tracks, some with a few merchants and a depot, others little more than saloons and rough boarding houses. Fugitives from Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas slipped into this patchwork and tried to vanish. Against that background, Grant and the other deputies who rode for Parker's court were expected to hold a line that shifted every time a new settlement appeared. Arrest numbers told only part of the story. Newspapers in distant cities might report that a deputy had brought in a certain number of prisoners in a season. Yet those statistics left out the hours of riding in silence, watching a distant rider to judge whether he was a ranch hand or a man who recognized the star and turned his horse away. They ignored the strain on a deputy who carried shackled prisoners in a wagon while family members rode behind, cursing and threatening revenge. Grant endured all of that. He did not measure success by headlines, but by the fact that when he brought a prisoner into Fort Smith or later into Muskogee, that man arrived alive and under control. The relentlessness that would later make him notorious among outlaws was already visible in these early years. When a trail ran cold, he circled wider, talking to farmers, railroad hands, and black freedmen working timber camps until someone mentioned a familiar face. If the weather turned ugly with north wind and sleet cutting across the prairie, he pulled his coat tighter and kept going as long as the horse could see the ground. Turning back without a strong reason felt like breaking faith with the victims and witnesses who had trusted him to act. In Creek communities, people began to speak of him as the man who did not let go once he had a name on paper. Parents remembered how he handled drunk troublemakers at dances without letting violence spill onto bystanders. Women who had suffered at the hands of husbands or neighbors told each other that this deputy listened seriously and tried to push their complaints through a federal system that often treated such cases as unimportant. That reputation mattered as much as his speed with a gun. It meant that when he rode into a village and asked for information, elders weighed old grievances and recent favors before deciding whether to help. By the time the new decade opened, Grant Johnson's work under Judge Parker's court had taken him along nearly every major wagon road and many unmarked trails between Fort Smith and the heart of Creek Nation. He had ridden in snow and blistering heat, crossed flooded streams, and walked prisoners up the stone steps of the courthouse while curious crowds watched. His name had started to appear in regional newspapers as one of the black deputy marshals who rarely failed to bring someone in when he took out a warrant. Among the men who lived by robbery and murder, the knowledge spread that a deputy with strong Creek features and an unshakable stare might suddenly appear in a doorway or on a train platform. Those years built a foundation that later Feats would stand on. The partnership with Bass Reeves hardened his resolve and sharpened his skills. The constant movement across tribal lines taught him how fragile order could be in a country where so many authorities overlapped. Above all, the early 1890s confirmed something he had already suspected as a young man helping elders and soldiers communicate. In a land filled with hidden trails and divided loyalties, the man who combined courage, patience, and local knowledge could change the balance between law and lawlessness. Grant Johnson was already becoming that man, even before the train gunfight near Chakotah and the later famous captures that would carry his name far beyond Indian Territory. March 3, 1891. The passenger train from Muskogee to the south moved on a regular schedule that evening, its lanterns swaying gently as it crossed the dark land between scattered settlements. Inside the second-class coach, the air smelled of coal smoke, damp wool, and the sour trace of tobacco spit that had dried on the floor. Men and women settled into hard wooden seats, clutching carpetbags and parcels, their faces lined by long days of travel. Near the stove, a rough-looking man in a broad white hat sat with his back to the car wall, the brim low over his eyes as he watched the aisle. United States Deputy Marshal Grant Johnson stepped on board at Muskogee with his warrant packet tucked inside his coat and his pistol riding in its familiar place at his hip. He had ridden hard that day, clearing business in town and checking on prisoners who would soon move through the new federal courts. The train ride south offered a brief chance to rest his legs before he returned to Eufaula, where more work waited. Still, he did not relax his attention. Any place where strangers gathered, whether a ball game or a crowded coach, might put him close to a man whose name sat on paper in his pocket. As the coach rocked along the track, Johnson moved slowly up the aisle, letting his eyes take in each passenger. Years of trail work had sharpened his memory for faces. A bad light, a changed beard, or a different hat could not easily hide a man he had once arrested. Near the middle of the coach, his gaze settled on the man in the white hat. The set of the jaw, the line of the cheek, and the tight way the fellow held his hands on his knees cut through the disguise of worn clothes and travel dirt. Johnson felt a jolt of recognition. Months earlier, he had taken a murderer into custody, a man accused of killing in cold blood and leaving a body in Indian Territory. That prisoner had ridden under guard toward Fort Smith, shackled but defiant. Somewhere along that route, he had broken free and vanished. Johnson had not forgotten the escape. Now the same eyes looked back at him from under the brim of a white hat. The deputy did not let his surprise show. He walked past without pausing, his boots steady on the boards, then stopped only when he reached the end of the coach. At the door, he stepped through into the next car, letting the curtain drop behind him. There, in the narrow space between coaches, he took a breath and checked his weapon. The steel felt solid under his hand, the cylinder turning smoothly as he eased it just enough to be sure it would fire without hesitation. The train clattered on into the dark, wheels pounding the joints in the rail with a constant metallic rhythm. Johnson weighed the choices. If he moved too soon, the man might use a civilian as a shield. If he hesitated, the opportunity could vanish into the night at the next stop. He decided to approach from the front, where there would be less chance of bullets passing through the length of the coach. He opened the door to step back toward second class, intending to come up behind the suspect with the element of surprise. Instead, as he pushed the door outward, it swung into a man already on the platform. The fugitive had left his seat and followed him between the cars. The motion of the train forced both men to plant their feet wide as the wind tore at their coats. For a moment they stood almost shoulder to shoulder with only a few feet between them on the small metal platform. The murderer moved first. His hand flashed from his coat, bringing a pistol up toward the deputy's chest. The muzzle flared, the first report loud in the night as the bullet tore past, missing its mark and chewing into the end wall of the first-class coach. Without flinching, Johnson drew his own revolver and fired back. The recoil pushed through his arm, but his stance held firm despite the swaying car. Sparks from their shots whipped away into the darkness behind them as the train rolled forward at roughly 30 miles an hour. Inside the adjacent coaches, passengers screamed and ducked as the sound of gunfire ripped through the thin walls. Some grabbed loved ones and threw themselves onto the floor, convinced that bandits had stopped the train for a robbery. Others pressed against the opposite windows, trying to get away from the direction of the shots. The conductor shouted orders that few could hear clearly over the clatter of wheels and the echo of gunfire between cars. Panic spread more quickly than information. On the platform, the fight continued in a confined space where there was no cover but motion and nerve. Johnson kept one shoulder turned, making himself as narrow a target as possible while he tracked the fugitive's movements. Each time the other man fired, the deputy watched the angle of the barrel and shifted just enough to throw off the shot. The desperado's bullets tore splinters from the coach end and left fresh scars in the wood, but none struck the deputy. Johnson's own shots drove the man back toward the rail, forcing him to stumble as the car lurched over a rough joint. In total, 8 rounds cracked out into the night, a brief battle measured in seconds rather than minutes. The train never stopped. The engineer, unaware of the full situation behind him, kept the throttle steady, focused on keeping the heavy train on the rail. Sparks from the smokestack blew backward over the roofs of the cars, mixing with the flash of pistol fire near the middle of the consist. Passengers who dared peek through windows caught glimpses of 2 figures struggling on the narrow platform and then lost sight of them as the cars swayed. Pressed by fire and with the metal grab iron at his back, the fugitive made a final, desperate decision. He threw himself sideways off the moving train, vanishing into the darkness beyond the railbed. For an instant, his body was a pale blur against the night, and then he struck the ground and rolled away into the weeds and brush beside the track. Johnson stepped to the edge of the platform, his weapon still ready, but the speed and darkness made a clean follow-up shot impossible. Firing blindly into the black land carried too much risk for people who might be sleeping near the right-of-way. He held his fire and signaled for the conductor. When the shaken railroad man reached him, Johnson gave quick, clear instructions. The train would continue to the next safe stop. Passengers would be calmed and counted. Telegraph operators down the line would be alerted that a murderer had jumped from the train near Chakotah and might be wounded or on foot, armed and dangerous. Only then, with the immediate danger contained, did the deputy step back inside the coach. The scene there reflected the raw shock of what had happened. Men who had been dozing now sat rigid with eyes wide, grips clenched so tightly on their bags that knuckles showed white. Women held crying children close, murmuring to them as they tried to still their own shaking. A few passengers stared at Johnson's badge with new understanding. They realized that the gunfire had not marked the start of a robbery, but an attempt by a federal officer to keep a proven killer from walking free among them. Johnson moved down the aisle once more, not to search faces this time, but to check for injuries. His gaze passed over each person in turn, looking for blood, torn cloth, or the staring shock that might signal a hidden wound. The bullets that had missed him had buried themselves in the wood at the front of the coach, leaving ragged holes and splintered edges. By simple fortune and the fugitive's poor aim, none of the passengers had been hit. The damage was confined to timbers and nerves. When he reached the far end of the coach, he paused and set his hand briefly against the wall where one slug had lodged. The rough break in the wood told a plain story. A slight difference in aim or stance could have put that metal into his chest or into the body of a passenger sitting only a few feet away. He did not dwell on the thought. In his line of work, close calls stacked up quickly enough to crush any man who spent time counting them. Instead, he filed the fact away and turned his mind to the next steps. At the next station, the train crew and Johnson made their report. His description of the fugitive's face, build, clothing, and voice went out over the telegraph wires toward lawmen and station agents up and down the line. Section hands and track walkers who worked near Chakotah were warned to keep their eyes open for any injured stranger stumbling along the right-of-way. In nearby settlements, residents heard that a man who had already escaped once from custody was again loose, this time somewhere along the path of the MKT line. The incident came to the attention of newspapers far beyond Indian Territory. Within days, readers in Texas saw headlines regarding a marshal and an escaped convict trading shots on a moving train. The reports described the fight as a shooting scrape, but made clear that the man in the broad white hat had already proven dangerous and that it was only quick action on the part of Deputy Marshal Grant Johnson that kept the situation from turning into a massacre inside the crowded coaches. Those accounts added to his growing reputation as a lawman who stayed steady under fire. For Johnson himself, the gunfight counted as one more example of how quickly routine travel in his district could turn violent. He had boarded the train expecting only a ride home and a chance to think over upcoming warrants. Within minutes, the appearance of a familiar face had forced him into a life-and-death struggle on a narrow platform with no cover. Many men would have hesitated or waited for help at the next stop. He had chosen instead to confront the danger directly, trusting his judgment and his ability to control his weapon under brutal conditions. The fugitive's leap into the darkness did not erase the value of the encounter. The man could no longer ride that train unnoticed. Conductors, brakemen, and passengers along the route would remember his features and his habit of slouching under a white hat. The report on file at the marshal's office added detail that would aid future identification. And above all, outlaws who heard the story understood that Grant Johnson did not limit his work to daylight raids on cabins or quiet arrests at country dances. He would fight on a moving train at full speed if that was what the moment required. Back in Eufaula, residents took in the news with a grim sort of pride. Many already knew Johnson as the deputy who patrolled their streets, spoke their languages, and rode out to serve warrants in distant districts. The tale of the train fight showed another side of the man they saw leading prisoners down the street or breaking up brawls near the depot. It confirmed that the quiet marshal who liked cigars and spoke in measured tones would stand his ground in the most exposed, dangerous situations without backing away. The MKT incident also hardened Johnson's own resolve. He had seen how close a wanted man could come to walking freely among unarmed travelers, and he had felt the way fear spread when people believed a train faced robbery. From that day on, each time he boarded a coach, he checked faces with even sharper attention. No trip by rail or wagon was ever just transportation. Every mile offered another chance to spot a name from his warrants, another opportunity to keep a murderer or thief from slipping through the cracks of a land where jurisdiction shifted from town to town and nation to nation. March in Indian Territory still carried cold rain and late winter wind. When Johnson stepped down from the train later that night and led his horse through the familiar streets of Eufaula, he wore the same calm expression that people had come to expect. Those who saw him pass had no way of knowing how many bullets had just cut the air within arm's length of his body. The only outward sign of the event was a fresh entry in his papers and a firm note in his reports. Yet the legend of the deputy who fought a murderer on a moving train near Chakotah began to spread. Another piece in the growing picture of a fearless black law officer whose presence unsettled every outlaw who heard his name. September 24th, 1892. In a rough corner of the Creek Nation near Red Fork, a white woman named Mattie Biddle lay bruised and weak in a bed that was not her own. She had fled to the house of William Arnold after a beating that left her barely able to stand. Her husband, George Biddle, had used a stick on her with such force that neighbors believed she might not survive. With shaking hands, she dictated a letter to the one lawman whose name she knew well enough to trust. United States Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves, begging for protection from the man who had nearly killed her. The letter made its way across Indian Territory toward the Fort Smith court, carrying the details of her suffering and the fear that her husband would return to finish what he had started. Reeves already carried a full load of cases and could not make the ride himself. Among the deputies who worked with him, one stood out as both capable and close to the ground where the crime had occurred. That man was Grant Johnson of Eufaula, Creek freedman, veteran trail officer, and a deputy marshal who understood the communities around Red Fork. When Johnson read the report, he saw more than words on paper from a frightened woman. He saw a pattern that had long troubled the territory, where men who drank hard and carried grudges believed a wife or child could take blows without the law stepping in. The federal court in Fort Smith reached into the Creek Nation for crimes of murder and severe assault, but victims often had no voice strong enough to carry that far. In this case, the words of a battered woman did reach the records, and Johnson decided they would not be ignored. On October 9, 1892, Johnson put formal language to his intention. In a written request to the Fort Smith authorities, he laid out the facts as he knew them. He named George Biddle as the man responsible for a brutal assault with intent to kill. He identified Mattie as the victim and noted that she now lay in William Arnold's house, not expected to live. The statement was clear and direct, built on his habit of speaking in plain terms that judges and clerks could not mistake. The answer that came back did not match the urgency of the situation on the ground. The court denied the request for a warrant. No explanation came with the refusal, only the fact that the system that claimed to protect the weak had chosen not to move. In many parts of Indian Territory, such a denial would have ended the matter. Without the legal paper in hand, most deputies would have turned to other cases. Johnson did not set the file aside. News came that Mattie's injuries had worsened and that she had died without ever seeing her husband held to account. For Johnson, her death changed the question. It was no longer a simple matter of assault, but a killing that demanded federal attention. He prepared a second request, again describing the beating and the condition of the victim, this time noting that she had succumbed to her injuries. The deputy did not soften his language for the comfort of the officials at Fort Smith. He pressed the point that a woman had called upon federal law and that the response could not be a silence that rewarded a murderer. Taken together, his persistence and the grave outcome left the court little room for delay. This time the warrant came through. On October 16, 1892, Johnson received the authorization to arrest George Biddle on the charge that he had beaten his wife with intent to kill and that she had died as a result. With legal authority in hand, Johnson saddled his horse and turned toward the north and west, following the routes that led into the Creek Nation land around Red Fork. The autumn air carried a sharp edge as he left Eufaula, the wind bringing the smell of wood smoke and hard earth from scattered homesteads along the way. The ride to Red Fork followed familiar ground. Johnson knew the small settlements that dotted the trails, the locations of ferry crossings, and the stretches of timber where a man could vanish if he had enough warning. His work as a deputy had taught him that an abuser could be as dangerous as any train robber when cornered. He treated the journey as he would any manhunt for an armed suspect, checking for fresh tracks near cabins and listening carefully to each piece of information offered by Creek and freedman families along the route. Red Fork itself stood near the Arkansas River, a railhead community with a depot, a few stores, and houses scattered between patches of open land. Freight wagons rolled to and from the tracks, and smoke from locomotives drifted across the low buildings. Johnson rode in without declaration, his wide-brimmed hat shading his eyes as he studied the faces around the station and the nearby streets. Word traveled fast in settlements that size. By the time his horse's hooves clicked on the packed ground near the depot, several people already knew there was a deputy marshal in town. He learned that Biddle had been seen near the settlement, moving between odd jobs and drinking spots. The man had treated the first refusal of a warrant as a sign that he could continue his life without interference. Johnson did not waste words discussing that mistake. He asked pointed questions, sorted through the rumors, and narrowed his search to the places where a man with a temper and a taste for liquor would most likely be found. Late in the day, he saw his man. George Biddle emerged from a low building near the tracks, shoulders hunched, hat pulled down. The casual stride of a man who believed the worst of his trouble had already faded into the past. Johnson watched him for a moment, judging his balance in the set of his hands, looking for signs that a pistol might be close at hand. He then stepped forward with deliberate calm, closing the distance until his presence could not be ignored. When Biddle recognized the badge and the face behind it, his expression shifted from confusion to anger. He had counted on the distance between Red Fork and Fort Smith and on the first denial of a warrant to keep him free. Instead, he found himself facing a deputy marshal who had ridden in specifically to take him into custody for the killing of his wife. Johnson spoke clearly, naming the charge and ordering him to submit. For a few tense seconds, no one spoke. People nearby sensed the danger and drifted back toward doorways and corners, watching without stepping in. Biddle's hands twitched near his belt, where a knife or pistol might have been hidden. Johnson's own hand hovered near the butt of his revolver, ready to draw and fire if the man chose resistance. Biddle's courage faltered. His hands dropped away from his belt, and Johnson moved in, taking hold of his arm and turning him to apply iron cuffs. The arrest came without bloodshed, though every person who watched understood that it had come close to ending in gunfire. Johnson saw to it that Biddle was secured and transported toward the federal court system that had finally recognized the seriousness of his crime. The records do not reveal how the trial ended, but the arrest itself sent a message through the territory. In a place where violence against women often took place behind closed doors, the story spread that a deputy marshal had pushed past official reluctance and ridden directly into the heart of a small community to bring an abuser to account for killing his wife. Winter settled over the Creek Nation that year with cold winds and hard rain. While the Biddle case moved through whatever channels the court allowed, Johnson turned his attention to another kind of crime that cut into the lives of people who worked hard for a living. Ranchers near Chakotah began to notice that cattle vanished from the open ranges. Not one or two animals that wandered off, but whole groups that disappeared between one count and the next. On the grasslands outside Chakotah, cattle grazed under brands that marked ownership for all to see. Men like rancher T.W. Turk depended on those herds for their livelihood. When Turk found that 31 head had gone missing, he knew that simple straying could not explain it. The pattern suggested deliberate theft, with someone driving the animals off the range and sending them along the rail lines to distant markets. Johnson rode out to meet Turk and walk the ground where the cattle had last been seen. Hoof marks cut into the soil, showing a mass of animals herded in a direction that did not match the usual paths to water or shelter. The deputy listened as Turk described the missing stock, the brands, and the timing of the loss. Together they followed the traces toward the nearest shipping points, piecing together how rustlers had used the growing network of railroads to turn stolen beef into cash far from where the animals had grazed. Information from stockmen and railroad workers pointed toward Kansas City, where Buyers at the stockyards handled large numbers of cattle from across the region. Somewhere in that busy market, the missing animals had been sold under the names of men who had no right to them. Johnson understood that to break the ring he needed not only to identify the thieves but also to confront them on their chosen ground. In early January 1893, reports reached Kansas City that federal authorities had made progress on the case. A dispatch in a major newspaper soon carried the details. Two men, W.H. Heath and his son G.W. Heath, had been arrested in Kansas City on charges that they had stolen 31 head of cattle from near Chakotah and shipped them north for sale. Deputy United States Marshal Grant Johnson of Eufaula arrived in the city with a federal warrant sworn out by Rancher Turk, prepared to see that the cattle thieves faced justice. The Kansas City stockyards were filled with pens, shouting drovers, and the constant noise of animals and trains. Johnson stepped into that environment with the same steady focus he carried on the trails. He conferred with local officers, verified the identities of the Heaths, and saw that they were taken into custody under the authority of the warrant he carried. The arrest cleared the mystery that had troubled ranchers near Chakotah and showed that law from Indian Territory could reach far beyond its borders when needed. Turk told reporters that the Heaths had led a gang engaged in running cattle off the ranges, and Johnson stated that more arrests would follow. One family might handle the shipping and sales, while others gathered animals on the ground or provided information about herd locations. By moving swiftly against the men at the center, Johnson weakened the arrangements that had made such theft profitable. Within months, another case underscored his attention to crimes against property that might seem small to outsiders but meant survival for local families. For 6 weeks in early 1893, an unknown thief had broken into smokehouses around Eufaula, cutting meat from hooks and carrying it off into the night. Nearly 500 pounds disappeared in total, including 200 pounds taken from the smokehouse of a man named Marion Horn in a single raid. When Horn reported his latest loss, Johnson did not treat it as a minor matter. Working families depended on smoked meat to see them through the lean months when fresh supplies were scarce. Johnson followed tracks, asked questions in alleys and back rooms, and watched for signs of sudden plenty among men who had no honest income. Late one evening, he returned to town with two brothers in custody, Bill and Ned Yates, accused of being the meat thieves who had plagued Eufaula. He had strong evidence against them and prepared to take them to Fort Smith to answer for their repeated raids on people's winter food. For residents of Eufaula, it meant that the man who carried a badge in their streets cared as much about stolen meat as he did about escaped murderers and cattle rings. Taken together, the Biddle case, the breaking of the Heath cattle operation, and the capture of the Yates brothers showed a consistent pattern in Johnson's work. He did not measure crimes only by the number of shots fired or the reputation of the people involved. He looked at who suffered. A beaten woman, a rancher watching his herds shrink, and a town robbed of its winter provisions all found the same determined response. In the span from the fall of 1892 through the spring of 1893, his reputation grew among ordinary people who saw that the black deputy marshal from Eufaula stood between them and those who would use fists, guns, or quiet theft to take what they could. Outlaws who had once mocked the ability of federal officers to reach into their circles now heard that Johnson would ride after a wife-beater, track cattle across state lines, and spend nights hunting down a thief who specialized in smokehouses. Every new arrest added weight to his name, shaping the image of a lawman who would not look away from any abuse, whether it took place in a private bedroom on an open range or in the dark backlots behind a small town's homes. July 19, 1893. Lantern lights spilled from the windows of the dance hall at Brooklyn in the Creek Nation, throwing yellow rectangles across the packed dirt yard. Inside, a fiddle sawed out a fast tune while boots thumped the floor in rough time. Men in sweat-darkened shirts and women in calico dresses crowded the room, the heat and noise pushing against the thin plank walls. Among them stood a compact white man whose name carried weight from Arkansas courtrooms to the far edges of Indian Territory. Abner Brassfield, convicted killer and escaped prisoner. 3 years earlier in Harrison, Arkansas, Brassfield had shot and killed Justice of the Peace William Ham during a dispute. A court had convicted him of murder and sentenced him to 21 years in prison. While his case moved through the appeal process, he had broken free from custody and disappeared into the tangle of family ties and rough settlements on the far side of the Arkansas line. His trail led into the Creek Nation, where relatives and associates gave him shelter, and where he believed distance from Arkansas authorities meant safety. Grant Johnson had studied that file. The facts were not complicated. A justice of the peace dead, a white killer convicted and sentenced, an escape during appeal, and a fugitive living openly under a slightly altered name. Newspaper notices and court communications made clear that the man still walked free. When reliable word reached Fort Smith that Brassfield would attend a dance at Brooklyn, the chance to end that freedom moved quickly into the hands of the deputies who knew the country best. Johnson rode toward Brooklyn with fellow Deputy Bass Reeves and Posseman Andy Deering. The road carried them through timber and open patches where the night sky pressed close. They spoke little as they approached the settlement. Each man understood the situation. A crowded dance hall meant limited room for gun work and a high chance of innocent people caught between bullets if the arrest turned into a fight. At the same time, the crowd offered cover for a quiet approach. Surprise would have to do the work that sheer force could not. They left their horses in the shade of a few trees and walked the last stretch on foot. Music and shouts slipped through the cracks in the walls. Johnson paused outside the door, listening for the particular cadence of a man who carried himself like someone who had once stood in court and listened while a judge spoke the word years. Inside, he and Reeves stepped through the doorway with their hats low and coats hanging easy over their pistols. Deering positioned himself where he could block the exit. For a moment, the dancers kept moving. Then faces turned toward the newcomers and the music faltered. Johnson's eyes swept the room and stopped on a stocky figure near the center, a man whose features matched the description in the warrant and whose posture spoke of a certain hard confidence. In that instant, recognition passed between them. Brassfield saw the badges and knew that the time he had borrowed since his escape had run out. Johnson did not waste words. He crossed the floor in a straight line, shoving past startled dancers. Before Brassfield could reach for a weapon, the deputy wrapped both arms around him, pinning the outlaw's arms to his sides and clamping him at the waist. With a surge of effort, Johnson dragged him bodily away from the center of the room. A few shouts went up, but no one stepped in front of the determined lawman. Reeves cleared space ahead, pushing people back from the door as Johnson hauled the struggling prisoner through it and out into the night air. Outside, under the lanterns by the door, Deering snapped irons onto Brassfield's wrists and secured his legs with chains. The outlaw cursed and twisted, but the three officers kept their grip steady. The arrest had come exactly as the reports later said, with Brassfield surprised completely at a dance and carried out of the building by a deputy who refused to let go. Behind them, the music had stopped entirely, the quiet inside the hall matching the stunned silence in the yard. They mounted up for the ride to Eufaula. Brassfield sat on a horse in the middle, his hands fastened to the saddle and his feet linked by chain beneath the animal's belly. Johnson rode on one side, Reeves on the other, with Deering nearby. They did not allow the prisoner to dismount along the route. The small column moved through the dark hills, hoofbeats steady on the packed earth, while word of the arrest spread ahead of them along family lines and informal messengers. Friends and relatives of Brassfield followed behind, determined to see what would happen in town. Eufaula in 1893 was still a small place with a depot, a post office, a few stores, and scattered houses near the tracks. When the party rode in, residents turned out to watch. A convicted murderer who had slipped away from Arkansas justice now sat chained in their streets under the guard of two black deputy marshals whose names had already begun to appear in newspapers across the region. The officers lodged Brassfield under Deering's watch and stepped away long enough the next morning to take breakfast, expecting that the irons and the presence of a deputy would hold the prisoner secure. The calm broke that evening. As the light faded in the eastern part of town, rapid shots shattered the routine quiet. People on the streets darted for doorways. Men shouted in confusion, unsure whether bandits had struck the town or a quarrel had erupted between locals. The source of the gunfire became clear within minutes. Brassfield had escaped. In front of the post office, the prisoner had been allowed to dismount for a short time. The chain still hung from his ankle and one cuff remained on his wrist, but the restraint around his body had loosened. Family members who had followed from Brooklyn stood nearby. In that small circle, his father handed him a pistol. Steel in hand, Brassfield stepped back away from Deering, bringing the weapon up with the sudden, reckless energy of a man who knew that a 21-year sentence waited if he submitted. Deering shouted for him to stop. Brassfield answered with gunfire. The deputy drew and fired back. Townspeople watching from a distance saw muzzle flashes and heard repeated cracks as bullets smashed into dirt and wood. Later accounts counted 10 or 12 shots in all. The noise filled the street and sent people scrambling behind barrels, hitching posts, and any other cover they could find. But by fortune and aim, no observer took a bullet. The fight stayed between the man with the pistol and the officer trying to hold him. In the chaos, Brassfield forced his way free. Whether he shot at the chain, at the deputy, or simply used the weapon to drive everyone back, the effect was the same. The man who had been marched into town under chains now broke away from the point of arrest in a storm of gunfire. He ran, the iron still dragging from his ankle, and vanished into the dark edges of Eufaula while fear and anger rolled through the crowd he left behind. Johnson and Reeves left their meal the instant they heard the reports thundering across town. When they reached the scene, the fight was over and the prisoner was gone. Deering stood shaken but alive. The two senior deputies did what they could with what remained. They clamped irons on Brassfield's father and another relative, charging them with aiding the escape. The message in that act was plain. Anyone who put a weapon into the hands of a convicted killer under guard would face consequences under the same federal system that had put the son behind bars in the first place. News of the escape spread rapidly. The Dallas Morning News told readers that the convicted Arkansas murderer had been arrested at a dance, carried bodily from the building by Deputy Marshal Grant Johnson, and then had broken free in Eufaula after his father gave him a pistol. The paper reported that a burst of shots had rattled the town and that the prisoner had shot himself free and vanished, leaving behind two arrested relatives and a shaken deputy, but no dead or wounded citizens. The account tied Johnson's name firmly to both the bold capture and the chaotic escape. For the first time in many months, an outlaw had slipped out of chains within Johnson's reach. He did not treat that failure as a reason to back away from difficult cases. Instead, he folded it into the ongoing work. Brassfield had gone to ground again. The deputies tightened the watch on people who had aided him, sent word through networks of informants, and kept space in their thoughts for the day when his name would again appear in a telegraph or a court notice. 2 years passed. During that time, Brassfield drifted southward. A detective in Texas confronted him and fired, shattering his arm and ending any illusion that he could continue indefinitely as a free man. The injury, the constant pressure of pursuit, and the knowledge that his name lay on formal convictions in Arkansas weighed heavily. Finally, he returned to the one lawman in Indian Territory whom he knew would handle the surrender in a clear, direct way. He came back to Eufaula and gave himself up to Grant Johnson. When Brassfield walked into Johnson's reach again, His arm bore the damage from the Texas bullet. He no longer faced the deputies with the swagger he had shown at Brooklyn. Johnson took custody without theatrics. Papers were put in order, guards assigned, and the path back to Arkansas opened. Brasfield went to the state prison at Little Rock and served 4 years. A governor's pardon eventually released him. The man who had once traded shots to break from custody now returned to the Creek Nation not as a fugitive but as a paroled convict. In a twist that startled many, he then worked on the law force at Eufaula. Contemporary recollections and later family interviews agree that Brasfield served under Johnson as an assistant, using his knowledge of the country and of outlaw methods to help catch the very kind of men he had once joined. Johnson did not forget the risk the man had posed. He did not erase the memory of lantern light and a dance cut short by an arrest, or the crack of shots in Eufaula streets. He did, however, accept the reality that a former enemy could, under close watch, become a tool against the lawless element that still threatened his town. During those same years, other cases pushed Johnson into equally tense confrontations. In February 1895, a white man named Wade Chamberlain, previously arrested for harboring train robbers at Blackstone Switch and then released after a preliminary hearing, rode into Muskogee and spoke casually with Johnson. Neither man yet knew that a federal grand jury had handed down a new indictment against Chamberlain the day before. When another deputy, George Lawson, learned of the fresh charges, he asked Johnson if he knew Chamberlain well enough to point him out. Johnson did not hesitate. The two lawmen shared a brief laugh over the fact that the wanted man had just spent part of his day talking with one of the deputies assigned to the district. Then they walked into one of Muskogee's better establishments and arrested Chamberlain on the spot, ending his brief window of unknowing freedom. That summer brought a different kind of confrontation. In June 1895, the Fort Smith elevator reported that Deputy Marshal Grant Johnson had encountered 3 whiskey peddlers near Eufaula. When he moved to arrest them, the men chose to fight rather than submit. The confrontation turned lethal. Johnson shot one of the smugglers dead and captured the other 2. The brief notice in the paper did not dwell on detail, but the facts it recorded marked a line. Johnson would listen patiently when people cooperated. When men dealing in illegal liquor raised weapons against him, he answered with direct, controlled gunfire and finished the job. In July, another report placed him at a location that many law officers preferred to avoid. Younger Bend, on the Canadian River in the Cherokee Nation, carried a reputation built during the time when Belle Starr lived there. Settlers and lawmen alike called it a refuge for criminals. A bend in the river where brushy bottoms, tangled trails, and sympathetic households gave fugitives room to breathe. One early admirer of Johnson later called the place the suburbs of hell, and remembered that he went into it to hunt outlaws when other officers stayed away. In that harsh patch of country, Johnson sought a man named John Moore, wanted for assaulting his wife. Many deputies focused their attention on headline-grabbing train robbers or stage holdups. Johnson's record in the mid-1890s shows something different. Once again, he took aim at a man accused of brutal violence inside his own home. He did not let the reputation of Younger Bend deter him. He rode into the rough ground, followed the narrow paths between scrub and trees, and brought Moore out under arrest. The Kansas City Times described Younger Bend as a famous criminal hiding place and noted that Johnson had entered it and left with his prisoner, another mark on a growing list of cases in which he answered domestic brutality with firm federal action. By the end of 1895, a clear pattern stretched from the Brooklyn dance hall to the river bend once associated with Belle Starr. Johnson had seized a convicted murderer in the middle of a crowded gathering, wrestled him out of the building, and then faced the embarrassment and danger of that man's escape in a street gunfight. He had accepted the surrender of the same outlaw years later and folded him into a disciplined law force. He had laid a hand on the shoulder of a man like Wade Chamberlain inside a respectable establishment the day after a secret indictment and walked him out in irons. He had killed an armed whiskey peddler who chose to resist and had risked his life in a notorious outlaw refuge to drag a wife-beater before the court. None of those actions took place in isolation. Each arrest and each exchange of fire fed into the way people spoke his name. In Eufaula, Muskogee, and along the Canadian River, residents understood that this deputy confronted violence wherever he found it, whether in a dance hall, a busy town street, a fine dining room, or a tangle of brush by the river. Outlaws heard the same stories from the other side. They talked quietly of the night in Brooklyn when a black deputy had wrapped them up and carried them bodily through a crowd, of the gunfire in Eufaula that failed to knock him down, and of the day he rode alone into Younger Bend and came back with one of their own. In the tight span from 1893 through 1895, those events hardened the image of Grant Johnson as a man who did not step aside from risk. The capture and escape of Abner Brasfield, the later surrender of that same outlaw, the removal of Chamberlain from Muskogee's streets, the deadly clash with whiskey peddlers, and the arrest of John Moore in Younger Bend all underscored the same truth. Once he took hold of a case, he stayed with it, across months, years, and miles, until either the prisoner stood before a judge or died in the act of resisting. February 11th, 1895. In Muskogee, the grand jurors put their names to fresh indictments, and one of those sheets of paper carried the name of Wade Chamberlain, a white man who had already tasted the inside of a federal courtroom. He had been arrested once for harboring men tied to a train robbery at Blackstone Switch, had stood in front of a commissioner, and had walked away after a preliminary hearing. Now new evidence named him again, and the indictment waited in the clerk's office while riders came and went on the muddy streets outside. Grant Johnson did not see the indictment that day. He was in Muskogee on other business, moving between the marshal's office and boarding houses, checking on prisoners and listening to the constant hum of talk that never stopped in a town that sat at a crossroads of rail and river. He knew Chamberlain by sight as a man who drifted near outlaws without ever quite being counted as one of them. When Chamberlain rode into town on the 12th, he stopped to visit with Johnson as if they were simply acquaintances passing the time. The two men talked within sight of the very courthouse that now held the document that would put Chamberlain back in irons. Later that day, Deputy United States Marshal George Lawson stepped into the marshal's office with the fresh indictment in his hand and a simple request. He needed Chamberlain pointed out. Lawson had never laid eyes on him, and he asked Johnson if he knew the man well enough to pick him out in a crowd. Johnson understood at once what the paper meant. He also understood that only hours earlier he had stood on the street in easy conversation with the same man. The two deputies walked out together into Muskogee's better district, where the town's most fashionable establishment kept mirrors polished and bottles lined up behind a long bar. Lantern light and cigar smoke softened the edges of the room, and a piano worked through a tune in the corner. Chamberlain stood there as if nothing in the world threatened him. Without hurry, Johnson nudged Lawson, and the two broke into quiet laughter at the irony that one deputy had already spent the morning talking with the man the other needed to arrest. The mirth ended quickly. They crossed the floor, took Chamberlain by the arms, and told him he was under federal arrest again. In a few moments, a man who had spent months believing himself clear of trouble walked out between two deputies who did not raise their voices, but did not loosen their hands either. That kind of day defined Johnson's work in the mid-1890s. His territory stretched from Muskogee back to Eufaula and south and west into Creek country, and every ride carried the possibility that a man who waved and smiled had already been named in some indictment sitting on a desk miles away. The wagon roads wound through oak and blackjack, crossed creeks that flooded in spring, and climbed gentle ridges where a rider could see miles of open country. The distance between towns gave outlaws room to disappear, yet it also gave a deputy time to think about the people who depended on him to bring killers and thieves into custody. By July 1895, his attention turned to a case that had hung over the Okmulgee area for more than a year. A young Creek named Israel Carr had killed a white man, William Conway, near Okmulgee, and had gone on with his life while the dead man's name lingered in court files and family conversations. Johnson rode north toward Okmulgee as summer heat settled into the grasslands. Dust rose from the hooves of his horse and clung to his coat. The country near Okmulgee held timber along the streams and open stretches where a rider appeared long before he arrived, and everyone in a settlement could see who came and went. Johnson moved through that country with the same deliberate patience that had carried him through train cars and dance halls in earlier cases. Conway's death meant more than simple gunfire. It sharpened racial and tribal tensions that already ran through the territory. A Creek defendant and a white victim drew eyes from both directions, and any mishandling would be remembered. Johnson met Creek residents who knew the trails and white settlers who knew what it meant to sleep in a cabin with a murder still unresolved nearby. When he finally confronted Carr and placed him under arrest, he did it without gathering a crowd or turning the moment into a spectacle. The important fact was that a man who had taken a life near Okmulgee now headed toward a federal court instead of fading entirely into the timber. That autumn, another case raised feelings that were different but just as sharp. Near Eufaula, a man named Jonah Bristow had whipped his own son so savagely that the boy died. Word moved quickly along the section lines and into town. People talked in storefronts and along fence lines about what kind of father could kill a child with his own hands and still sleep under his own roof. In communities where many parents struggled to keep children fed through hard years, the thought of a boy beaten to death by his own father cut across race and language. Johnson rode out from Eufaula with that weight in his mind. The road passed small farms with smokehouses in the yards and fields still scarred from seasons of drought and flood. At Bristow's place there was no gunfight and no dramatic chase. The horror had already happened. Johnson put a man whose violence had burned itself out into irons and turned him toward the same court system that processed cattle thieves, train robbers, and murderers. In doing so, he showed that the badge reached inside the walls of a family home when a crime there was as brutal as anything on a lonely road. By 1896, the legal map of Indian Territory shifted under every deputy's feet. The federal courts at Muskogee, Ardmore, and McAllister gained full jurisdiction, and the old Fort Smith court that had sent so many men to the gallows no longer held Indian Territory cases. Judge Isaac Parker died that year, and with his passing an era of frontier justice ended. Johnson's last commission from the Fort Smith court was dated that same summer, closing out a long chapter in which he had carried prisoners east across the river to stand before Parker. Eufaula's citizens did not intend to let him drift away with those changes. A petition moved around town asking that Grant Johnson be named an officer of the Muskogee Court with headquarters at Eufaula. Merchants, farmers, and freedmen signed their names and sent the paper north. Marshal S. Morton Rutherford answered their request. Johnson received a deputy's commission tied to the Muskogee Court, with orders that kept him based in the same town whose people had staked their safety on his work. He now reported to Muskogee, but his daily rides and nightly walks still began and ended at Eufaula. Life there required more than chasing named outlaws. The town rested on the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas line, with trains bringing in new faces and carrying away prisoners. North Forktown's former residents had shifted west to Eufaula after the railroad came through, and the place carried traces of older Creek settlement alongside the square fronts and false facades of newer brick and lumber buildings. In the streets, Creek citizens, freedmen, and white merchants moved past each other in a steady mix that would have been rare farther east. Johnson spoke Muskogee, greeted Creek elders in their own language, and kept lines of communication open with freedmen who looked to him as proof that a black man with a badge could carry authority over every segment of the population. Summer celebrations showed that mix clearly. At one Emancipation Day in Eufaula, the Indian freedmen planned 2 picnics, one at each end of town. Each gathering had its own food, music, and barrels of potential trouble, with old grievances and liquor capable of turning a cheerful day into a chain of fights. Johnson knew he could not be in 2 places at once. He also knew that his mere presence often slowed men down who might otherwise reach for a bottle or a knife. On the morning of that Emancipation Day, he led a horse to a tree near one picnic ground. He tied the animal where every person entering the field could see it. The black animal stood there in the heat while people talked quietly about whether the deputy was somewhere nearby. Later in the day, Johnson rode his other horse to the opposite end of town and stayed there, quietly watching the crowd. Families spread blankets, children chased each other, and groups of men played cards or swapped stories. At the first grounds, the horse tied to the tree did its work. People there looked at the empty saddle and assumed that Grant Johnson waited nearby, listening even when he was miles away. Men who might have gone too far with drink or anger held their tongues. That Emancipation Day passed with less trouble than most, not because Johnson had been in 2 places, but because he had understood how people thought when they believed he could appear at any moment. When daylight faded, other duties began. Nights in Eufaula belonged to the saloons along the main street, the gambling rooms in their back sections, and the alleys that cut between businesses and houses. Lamps burned behind smoky glass and cast small pools of light on wooden sidewalks. The rattle of dice and the clink of glasses mixed with conversations in English and Muskogee. Johnson's boots carried him past all of it. He wore his familiar wide brim hat and black neckerchief with 2 revolvers on his belt and a Winchester in the scabbard if he patrolled on horseback. He did not swagger. People noticed that he moved with a steady, measured stride. Smokers watched him from doorways, and men with secret bottles in their pockets judged whether to step back into the shadows or stand where they were. Some nights he broke up dice games that blocked sidewalks or spilled into the street. On other nights he walked into arguments already burning hot and cut them off before hands reached for gun grips. His reputation for shooting when he had to and for bringing prisoners in alive when possible created a kind of balance. Outlaws and drifters knew that if he told them to drop a weapon, he meant it, and that if they chose not to, he would not hesitate. The same years brought regular Indian ball games that drew crowds from Creek communities. The matches between towns such as Eufaula and Okmulgee were more than sport. They settled pride and sometimes reopened the old wounds of politics, land disputes, and family quarrels. On fields outside the towns, players stripped down to shirts or bare chests and gripped curved sticks, ready to snatch and throw a small ball through improvised goals. The crowds lined the edges of the field, men and women pressed close, children darting along the margins. Tension at those games could turn into violence with little warning. Johnson's orders included keeping order at such gatherings because a fight there could easily spill into larger trouble. When word spread in early September 1899 that Eufaula and Okmulgee would meet for a big game near Chakotah, people rode in from miles away. The air held dust and the smell of sweat and crushed grass. Wagers passed from hand to hand. Old scores sat just under the surface. September 7, 1899, the Muskogee Phoenix carried a report that showed how quickly things could turn. The ball had just gone into play when players from the 2 towns began to grapple. What started as rough contact shifted into swinging fists and thrown bodies. In 2 or 3 minutes, the match dissolved into a fight that stretched along the field with men pulling at each other's shirts and shouting in Creek and English. Grant Johnson was there as deputy marshal. He did not stand back and wait for the crowd to exhaust itself. He moved into the thick of the melee where sticks and fists swung. Rather than choose sides or try to wrestle men apart one at a time, he drew his revolver and fired into the ground, close enough for dirt and fragments to sting ankles and shins. The sound of his shots cut through the shouting. Men who had been locked in struggle broke off and scattered. Nobody there mistook the message. The deputy with the white hat and the black neckerchief had decided the game was over, and anyone who ignored him risked taking a real bullet instead of dust in the legs. The crowd settled. The game ended. There was grumbling and sullen looks between the two towns, but no one died on the field that day. Families who had watched from the edges herded their children toward wagons. Riders swung into their saddles and turned their horses toward home. Behind them, they left a trampled patch of ground and the knowledge that one man's willingness to stride directly into a fight and fire into the earth had kept the contest from becoming a mass killing. By the close of 1899, stories like the Chamberlain arrest, the Auchmulgee murder case, the Bristow child killing, the quiet Emancipation Day, and the broken-up ball game formed a single picture of Johnson's work. He did not sort cases into high and low. He handled wealthy white men who harbored train robbers, Creek youths who killed, fathers who beat their children to death, and crowds that teetered on the edge of mob violence. Eufaula's people, Creek and black and white, had watched him bring dangerous men in alive, had seen him walk alone into disorders that would have driven many officers back, and had gone to bed many nights knowing that a single deputy patrolled their streets. Outlaws, whiskey peddlers, and men who carried grudges all understood the same point. In that stretch of the Creek Nation in the late 1890s, Grant Johnson's name stood between them and the law. December 25, 1900. Eufaula woke to cold, clear air and the noise of wagon wheels on frozen ground as families made their way toward town. Christmas fell on a Tuesday that year, and the streets around the depot filled steadily with buggies, farm wagons, and riders from the Creek Nation country all around. Children stared at the trains and at store windows. Men gathered near saloons and restaurants, and women compared prices at the counters. The usual tension of Indian Territory did not vanish, but for a few hours people concentrated on errands, greetings, and the small pleasures available on a winter holiday. Among those on the road that morning was a Creek ferryman named John Tiger. He worked on the Arkansas River south of Eufaula, carrying people in wagons across the water, and he had come into town with his wife. By the time their wagon rolled onto the streets, Tiger had already drunk heavily. Witnesses later said his wife took the reins for part of the trip, guiding the team while he sat beside her with a bottle within reach. When the horses finally halted near a small eating house, the man who stepped down from the wagon was not in control of himself. On the street, Tiger met a man named L.B. Roper. Words passed between them, sharp and quick. Several accounts agreed that Tiger threatened to kill Roper. In response, Roper grabbed a board and struck him hard, dropping him or driving him back against the wagon. For a brief moment, it looked as if the quarrel might end with nothing worse than bruises and curses. Instead, the blow marked the point where the day split apart. Tiger climbed back into the wagon and reached for his weapons. He had brought two, a Winchester rifle and a 6-shooter. When he stepped to the ground again, he carried both. Without warning, he fired. One shot, then another, then more, each report cracking against the buildings and echoing along the street. Men fell where they stood. One, then two, then three bodies dropped under his fire, killed almost instantly. A small boy farther away felt the tug and sting of bullets tearing the buttons from his pants. Shops and houses that had held relaxed Christmas conversations now shook with screams. People scattered in every direction. Some dove behind hitching posts or ducked into doorways, dragging others with them. Mothers pulled children from the open and pushed them under counters. Men who had gone unarmed into town for holiday errands suddenly realized that a drunken gunman stood in the street killing without aim beyond rage and confusion. The image that stayed with many who survived was simple and terrible. A creek man swaying slightly as he worked a lever and trigger and sent bullets into anyone who happened to stand in his path. United States Deputy Marshal Grant Johnson was in or near the business section of Eufaula when the first shots sounded. He had spent years walking those same blocks, breaking up brawls and moving whiskey peddlers along. His ears knew the difference between a single angry shot and repeated fire from a man using both hands with deadly intent. The pattern on that Christmas morning told him at once that someone with a long gun and a sidearm was loose in the street. He moved toward the sound without hesitation. As he advanced, fleeing townspeople streamed past him. Some shouted half-coherent warnings. Others pointed back toward the source of the gunfire, too panicked to form full sentences. Johnson noted their direction and the rhythm of the shots, which came in bursts as the gunman worked the Winchester and then paused to use the revolver. He kept his own weapons ready, revolver at hand and Winchester within reach, and used buildings and corners for what cover the narrow street allowed. Bodies already lay on the ground, faces still, clothing darkening where blood had spread. Tiger saw the black deputy marshal coming. By then he had killed 3 men and wounded others, and he knew that the law in Eufaula did not bluff or hang back. Instead of giving up, he turned and ran. For several strides, he sprinted along the street, weapons still in his hands. Then his feet hit a low fence or barrier and he stumbled. He fell forward, scrambled up, and pointed his 6-shooter back toward the man bearing down on him. Shots cracked again, now directed specifically at Grant Johnson. The deputy had closed the distance enough that the fight shifted from a general slaughter of unarmed citizens to a focused exchange between 2 armed men. A pair of large trees stood between them. Tiger reached one trunk and pressed himself against it, bringing his revolver around the edge to fire. Johnson took his own position behind the other tree. Now bullets snapped through bark and tore splinters into the air. The smoke of powder mixed with the smell of fresh wood. At such ranges there was no room for careless movement. Each time Tiger leaned out, his revolver flared and bark flew from the tree where Johnson sheltered. Each time Johnson answered, he aimed at the portion of Tiger's body exposed around the trunk. Residents later remembered the sound of bullets striking wood and the sight of chips falling instead of leaves. The space between the trees and the distance to nearby houses left little margin for error. Any shot that missed by more than a small amount risked striking someone still trying to crawl to safety. Johnson kept his nerves under control. Years of handling weapons in tight situations paid off on that bitter Christmas. He watched Tiger's rhythm, the way the Creek gunman edged out from the trunk and then jerked back. On one of those advances, he fired, sending a round that struck Tiger in the arm. The wounded man screamed, his weapon spinning from his hand. Pain and shock broke the desperate energy that had carried him through the earlier killings. With his arm injured and his advantage gone, he stopped shooting. The gunfire slowed, then ceased. The silence that followed was not complete. People still cried out over the bodies of the dead. Others sobbed with relief to find family members alive. Yet the rapid exchange of shots between trees had ended, and the man who had started it now stood under the command of the deputy marshal. Johnson moved forward carefully, keeping his weapon ready until he was sure Tiger would not reach for another firearm. Then he placed the Creek ferryman under arrest. The danger shifted immediately. The crowd that had fled now surged back toward the scene, faces twisted by shock and rage. 3 of their own lay dead. They saw the man responsible still breathing and within reach. Voices rose calling for a rope. Hands reached toward Tiger with violence in mind. In Eufaula and in many other towns in the territory, A mob could close around a prisoner and kill him before any formal court ever saw his face. Johnson stood between the prisoner and that possibility. Help came from another direction as well. A respected citizen named Foley stepped forward and addressed the crowd, urging them to stand back and let the law complete its work. Together, Johnson's physical presence and Foley's appeal pushed the line of yelling men away from the wounded Creek gunman. The deputy did not argue. He simply kept moving, guiding Tiger toward confinement. Those who came too close saw the level barrel of his weapon and thought again. They moved the prisoner to a secure place while doctors and friends turned their attention to the wounded and the dead. Families gathered around the bodies. Names were spoken in grief, curses in anger, prayers in weary resignation. The town that had begun its day with holiday routines now ended it with funerals to plan and statements to give. Johnson had prevented more deaths, but nothing could undo the first moments of Tiger's rampage. 3 households would never see their men return. In the days that followed, the shock settled into a grim narrative that moved beyond Eufaula. Newspapers across Indian Territory and in distant states printed stories describing a drunken Creek who had gone on a killing spree in the streets and the deputy who had stopped him. Accounts emphasized the number of men killed, the small boy whose buttons had been shot from his pants, and the fact that the lawman who closed in under fire was a black deputy marshal from Eufaula. For many readers, it was the first time they had seen Johnson's name. For people who lived near him, the stories confirmed what they already believed. January brought a different kind of response from those who had watched the events up close. Citizens in Eufaula quietly collected money, each contributing what he or she could spare. These were not wealthy people. They were storekeepers, farmers, blacksmiths, and railroad workers who had seen or heard what happened on Christmas Day. When they had enough to matter, they combined the coins and bills into a purse and sent it to Grant Johnson. Along with the money went a message stating that this was not a reward in the sense of buying his service. They had seen him act from duty, not from hope of payment. The purse, they wrote, was a mark of appreciation for the way he had risked his life and then kept his head during the ugly excitement that followed. Johnson accepted the gift with the same quiet that marked most of his career. By then, he had spent years hauling murderers, cattle thieves, and abusers into court. He had already lived through gunfights on moving trains and in narrow streets. The money helped his family, but the words carried their own weight. A community that sometimes argued over race, tribe, and politics had agreed at least on this point. When a man with 2 guns began killing people in the street, the black deputy from Eufaula had run toward the danger rather than away from it. The case against Tiger moved forward through the formal channels. Grand jurors considered the evidence. Witnesses described his drunken condition, his threats, his shots, and the bodies that fell. Johnson gave his own account of the gunfight among the trees and the wound he had delivered that ended it. The law would decide the punishment. For most residents, the more immediate comfort lay in knowing that the man who had torn their town apart on a winter morning sat in a cell instead of walking freely along the same street. In the weeks after Christmas, life in Eufaula resumed its usual pattern, worn but not broken. Trains still came and went. Church bells still rang on Sundays. Children still played near the depot and along the alleys behind stores. Yet people watched the streets with a sharper eye. They had seen how quickly an ordinary day could shift into something deadly. They had also seen one man walk steadily into gunfire to stop it. For Johnson, the Christmas gunfight became another entry in a long list of incidents that defined his work. It showed his readiness to confront a man who had already killed multiple people, his ability to use cover while under fire, his marksmanship under pressure, and his insistence on bringing a suspect in alive, even when a mob clamored for immediate revenge. It also underscored another truth that had followed him since the days when he carried warrants into Younger Bend and rode into outlaw territory. In the Creek Nation towns that ringed the rail lines and river crossings, many people of every background had decided that when the worst sort of trouble arose, they wanted Grant Johnson nearby. The memory of that Christmas morning stayed with Eufaula for many years. Older residents repeated the details to younger ones who had been children at the time, describing the shots, the panic, the trees, and the black deputy who strode forward while others ran. Those who knew Johnson personally added quieter scenes, moments when he stopped a fight before it started or talked a drunk into going home instead of picking up a bottle and a gun. Taken together, the stories formed a single picture. In the final year of the 19th century, as railroads and towns pressed deeper into Indian territory, one fearless black deputy marshal had proven again that he would stand between his community and anyone with enough rage and firepower to threaten it. January 27, 1901. The winter air along the Deep Fork and North Canadian rivers felt raw, and the timbered hills of the Creek Nation held more than cold wind. In the thickets near Hickory Ground, south of Eufaula, fires burned low in a snake faction camp where Cheeto Harjo, called Crazy Snake, and his followers had gathered. They rejected allotment, courts, and the white man's law, and now word had spread that federal soldiers were moving in, and that a black deputy named Grant Johnson had been put on their trail. Grant Johnson rode out from Eufaula that morning with Bunny McIntosh, a Creek interpreter who knew the leaders and spoke the language. The ground under their horses' hooves had frozen hard in places and turned to clinging mud in others. Every draw held brush that could hide a lookout or a rifle barrel. Johnson had spent years hunting whiskey runners and gunmen through these same folds of country, yet this ride carried a different weight. Crazy Snake and his men had whipped Creeks who accepted allotments and had threatened freedmen who worked with the federal courts. The Snakes had raised their own council house, chosen their own principal chief, and printed proclamations that claimed the old Creek Nation still lived, no matter what Washington decreed. Near midday, they reined in on a low ridge and looked down toward the grove where the Snake camp lay. Canvas tents, rough brush shelters, and wagons stood in a loose ring, smoke slipping between the branches. Men moved around the fires with rifles and shotguns in easy reach. Women and children stayed close to the wagons. A few ponies grazed toward the timberline, their breath hanging in the air. Johnson studied the scene for a long moment, then turned to McIntosh. They had no squad of cavalry at their backs, only two determined men under orders to pull the central figure out of this tense gathering without letting the camp turn into a battlefield. They did not creep in like raiders. Johnson rode straight down the slope with McIntosh at his side, keeping the horses at a steady walk. The men around the fires stiffened. Some gripped their rifles and one or two stepped behind tree trunks. Johnson kept his hands in plain view on the reins, his revolver holstered, his badge pinned where every man could see it. When they reached the outer edge of the camp, McIntosh called out in Creek, naming Johnson, naming the federal court, and naming Cheeto Harjo. Johnson sat silent while the words went back and forth, smoke drifting around them. This was not a street drunk with a gun or a single outlaw holed up in a shack. The Snake leaders had followers, sympathizers, and kin spread across the hills. After long minutes, a tall man in a blanket and hat stepped from one of the shelters. Harjo's face was lined, his jaw set, his eyes steady. He had fought for Creek independence for years and had no habit of bowing to any court. McIntosh addressed him directly, making clear that a warrant waited, that soldiers from Troop A had moved into the territory, and that more force would follow if the leaders refused to yield. Johnson watched Harjo's eyes, measuring whether defiance would turn into gunfire in the crowded grove. Harjo understood that if shooting started here on this cold Sunday, the federal response would crush his movement before it fully grew. After another exchange in Creek, he nodded once, and the tension around the fires eased. Harjo stepped toward Johnson and McIntosh, still wrapped in his blanket. Johnson dismounted and took him into custody with simple, practiced motions. There were no shackles and no taunts, just a firm hand on the arm and a clear path back toward the ridge. A few young men muttered, but the elders held them back. Harjo climbed into the saddle with them and left his camp under a winter sky, riding toward the army tents near Henrietta and the authority of a court he did not recognize. When Johnson handed Crazy Snake over to the soldiers later that day, the camp buzzed with orders, field telegraphs, and messengers. Federal officers wanted the arrest to send a message that the Creek Nation would not be allowed to run a second government by whip and decree. Johnson did not linger long. His job was not to write proclamations. He turned his horse toward Eufaula, the familiar streets, and the next warrant waiting on his desk. Behind him, mounted patrols spread out into the hills to gather more snake followers. Newspapers in distant cities later described how a black deputy marshal from Eufaula had walked into a hostile camp and ridden out with the rebellion's central figure without firing a shot. The Crazy Snake trouble did not end in a single day. Through 1901 and 1902, Harjo and his adherents tried to regroup more than once. Johnson helped lead a posse that picked up Harjo again, along with several followers, when the Snake Council tried to revive itself. This time, the arrests went forward without resistance. The men were marched to the nearest rail point and taken on toward Muskogee and Leavenworth. Another sign that federal authority pressed deeper into every corner of the old Creek Nation. For Johnson, the work meant long rides through timber and bottomland, long nights listening for hoofbeats and watching lamplight in isolated cabins, and the constant task of separating stubborn political talk from genuine threats of violence. Even when he was not chasing movement leaders, Johnson's days filled with the roughness of ordinary law in Eufaula. On September 6, 1901, that roughness turned deadly again. In the colored quarter of town, Frank Wilson and Wade Smith had fallen into a bitter quarrel. The dispute flared into gunfire when Wilson drew a revolver and fired 2 shots at the fleeing Smith. The bullets missed, but the noise brought people to doorways and sent others diving for cover. Wilson ran for his horse and kicked it into motion, dust rising in the lane behind him. Johnson heard the shots and mounted fast. He knew both men. A feud between them could burn into a string of killings if he let it run. He drove his horse after Wilson, the hooves hammering the rutted street as the deputy closed the distance. Witnesses later told how Johnson called for Wilson to halt and fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of his revolver rolling along the clapboard houses. Wilson twisted in the saddle and shouted that he would rather die than give up. Then he turned fully and leveled his pistol at the pursuing lawman. In that instant, the long years of trailing outlaws in rough country narrowed into one decision. Johnson shifted his weight, raised his own revolver, and fired once. The bullet slammed into Wilson's abdomen. The horse shied, and the wounded man tumbled into the dust, groaning and clutching his belly. As Johnson rode up and dismounted, Wade Smith appeared again with a shotgun in his hands, his face set with anger and fear. The quarrel that had started this chase still burned in him, and he brought the gun up, ready to finish Wilson where he lay. Johnson stepped between them. He did not draw down on Smith, but his voice cut through the shouting. He ordered Smith to lower the shotgun and made clear that no man under his watch would be executed in the road like a dog, no matter what he had done a few minutes earlier. Reluctantly, Smith backed away, and Johnson kept the bystanders at a distance while a doctor was summoned. Wilson received treatment but died the next day. The Indian Journal reported that a black man had been killed in the line of duty by a black deputy who refused to let revenge rule the street. It showed once more that Johnson's work demanded that he face danger not only from Creek gunmen and white whiskey traders, but also from men of his own community. When violence spun out of control, For Johnson, the year that had begun with the quiet arrest of Crazy Snake and had turned bloody with Frank Wilson's death showed the tangled nature of law in the territory. He could not choose his assignments. One day he rode into hills alive with talk of sovereignty and federal troops. The next he broke up a family brawl or a dice game that had spilled into the alley behind a saloon. In every case, his badge placed him between men who wanted to settle scores with guns and knives and a court system that demanded living prisoners and written indictments. The work did not lighten as the new century moved on. By 1904, Johnson had spent years hauling in whiskey sellers, railroad wreckers, and gunmen. The list of men he had captured or killed filled newspaper columns and court records. That autumn word spread of a fresh killing that struck close to his world. Deputy United States Marshal Ed Fink, a white officer who had worked many of the same trails and towns, had been murdered while trying to stop Indian bootleggers near Wetumpka. Fink had once been overpowered and beaten while making arrests in that area. Now on November 20th, 1904, when he moved again to halt whiskey traffic, two Creek outlaws named Jim Tiger and Peter Fish turned on him. They tried to push a load of contraband whiskey toward the Eufaula region. Fink pursued them on horseback and ordered them to halt. Instead, Peter Fish swung in the saddle, raised a Winchester, and shot the deputy dead in the road. The killing jolted lawmen across Indian territory. Fink had been one of their own, and his murder on a lonely stretch of trail reminded every deputy that any day's ride could end the same way. The marshal's office responded with a manhunt that spread from Muskogee to the Deep Fork and South Canadian rivers. Hundreds of deputies combed the country, questioning farmers, watching creek crossings, and studying tracks in sandbars and road dust. Johnson joined the hunt alongside J.F. Bud Ledbetter, a Muskogee-based deputy known for his relentless work. Ledbetter believed that Tiger and Fish would not stay away from kin. Tiger had relatives in and around Eufaula, families tied to the snake movement who knew the back trails as well as any posse. Ledbetter took a train from Muskogee to Eufaula with his horse in the stock car and found Johnson waiting for him at the depot, calm and ready. The two deputies moved out from Eufaula, checking cabins, creek bottoms, and brushy hollows where a man could stable horses and hide a small camp. They spoke with people in both English and Creek, weighing every answer and reading the silences. The search stretched over days. Nights in the saddle blurred together, broken by brief stops in lonely farmyards or at line camps where cowhands shared coffee and news. Johnson kept his eyes on the ground and the trees, searching for fresh tracks, smoke, or a flash of movement that did not fit the quiet landscape. Ledbetter's hunch finally narrowed their path. He felt that the killers would angle east toward Millette, near the junction of prairie and timber. The country there folded into ridges and swales that offered cover but still lay close enough to trails leading back toward Eufaula and family support. Johnson agreed, and they swung their route that way, following faint signs of recent travel, broken twigs and scuffed soil where horses had slid on damp slopes. Near Millette, 15 miles east of Eufaula, they came upon two men who fit the descriptions they had carried in their minds since Fink's murder. Jim Tiger and Peter Fish tried to blend into the sparse traffic in and out of the little settlement, but they could not hide their nervous eyes or the wear on their horses. Johnson and Ledbetter rode in with practiced calm, closing distance without a rash move that could spark a desperate fight in the middle of town. When the moment came, they moved as one. Johnson called out for the men to throw up their hands while Ledbetter covered them. The fugitives saw hard, faces, leveled guns, and no hint of hesitation. The arrest came without a shot. Tiger and Fish were disarmed, bound, and taken under guard. Later, during questioning, they admitted their part in the killing on the trail. Testimony and evidence sent Peter Fish to prison for life. while justice for Fink's murder closed another deadly chapter in the long war between lawmen and bootleggers. For Johnson, the capture of Fink's killers confirmed his standing among the most dependable deputies in the service. Other lawmen knew that when he joined a hunt, he stayed in the saddle until the last fugitive stood before a judge or lay in the ground. In the years that followed, he and Ledbetter continued to ride together on difficult cases, a team that blended Johnson's deep knowledge of Creek country and communities with Ledbetter's tenacity and experience around Muskogee. In July 1905, Johnson again found himself riding after a man wanted for murder. This time, the fugitive was Jonas McIntosh, a killer whose name stirred fear throughout the local settlements. McIntosh had shot a man and slipped away, moving across familiar trails and relying on kin and sympathizers for shelter. Johnson tracked him through heat and dust, talking to people who knew it could bring them trouble to admit anything. Piece by piece, he built the trail until it led to a hideout where McIntosh believed he was safe. Johnson approached with the same hard patience he had shown all his career. He knew that if he tried to drag McIntosh out without preparation, the man would open fire and others in the cabin risked being caught in the crossfire. When the time came, Johnson stepped forward with his weapon ready and his badge plainly visible, calling on McIntosh to surrender and face trial. Instead, the murderer reached for his gun. The exchange did not last long. Johnson fired and McIntosh fell. His brief run as a terror in the countryside ended by the same deputy who had faced down so many gunmen before him. By the close of 1905, Johnson's years as a deputy United States Marshal had piled up a record that stunned even hardened officers and outlaws. He had carried warrants for Creek, Cherokee, white, and black fugitives, brought in hundreds of prisoners, and killed several men who insisted on meeting the law with drawn weapons. His work against Crazy Snake's followers, his steady handling of deadly turmoil in his own neighborhood, his role in bringing in Ed Fink's killers, and his showdown with Jonas McIntosh all shaped the reputation that followed his name across Indian territory. Outlaws who boasted of defying sheriffs in small towns passed the word that they did not want to see Grant Johnson's tall figure riding toward them on the trail. November 16, 1907. In Eufaula, the new statehood day began with steam whistles, church bells, and the scrape of wagon wheels rolling over frozen ruts on Main Street, and Grant Johnson walked the boardwalk in a town that had just been told it now belonged to the state of Oklahoma, instead of the old Creek Nation and the federal Indian Territory courts. He no longer wore the commission of a deputy United States Marshal. He now carried the badge of a town policeman, stamped by a city government that was still getting used to its own authority. But the men who watched him pass knew he was the same lawman who had spent years riding the broad country between the Canadian and the Arkansas rivers. His change in status had started the previous winter when Marshal Leo Bennett told him that his federal commission would not be renewed. Johnson had worked nearly 2 decades as a deputy, first out of Fort Smith and then under the Northern District Court at Muskogee. And his arrest record had drawn the notice of judges, newspaper editors, and citizens across the territory. The order from Bennett ended that chapter without ceremony. Johnson did not give interviews or long speeches about it. He stayed in Eufaula, the town where his house stood and where he had brought in so many prisoners over the years, and accepted a position as a policeman for the city, assigned to patrol the African-American section of town east of the main business district. The streets he walked as a city officer were different from the long trails he had followed as a deputy, but the work still demanded resolve. In the black neighborhood of Eufaula, the houses stood close together, some log, some rough board, with smoke from cook stoves hanging low on damp evenings. Families of Creek freedmen, Chickasaw freedmen, and other African Americans who had followed the railroads and wagon roads into the territory filled the narrow lanes. Small churches opened their doors on weeknights for meetings and revival services. Saloons and gambling rooms stood closer to the depot and the main street, and bootleg liquor moved steadily through the alleys despite new state laws aimed at drying up the traffic. Johnson walked those streets in the evenings with his pistol on his hip and his eyes on every doorway and corner. He knew many of the residents by name. Some remembered him from the years when his jurisdiction had stretched hundreds of miles, and when a knock on the door from Grant Johnson meant a trip in irons to Fort Smith or Muskogee. In the black section of town, he listened to complaints about stolen hogs, unpaid debts, and men who brought whiskey where it was not wanted. When violence threatened, he stepped between neighbors with the same firmness he had once used on Outlaws. His presence on the streets reduced the need to draw a gun because the people there had seen what he did when he had no choice. Their memories of his time as a deputy followed him as he moved under the lamps and past the framed storefronts. Statehood changed the paper structure of the law, but it did not calm the competition between towns. By the time Oklahoma joined the Union, Eufaula and nearby Chakotah were locked in a struggle for control of the new McIntosh County seat. Legislators and lawyers had argued over the issue in Guthrie and in courtrooms, and elections had been fought that turned on handfuls of votes. When the ballots and court orders failed to settle the matter, men on both sides began to talk openly of settling it with guns. The anger in Chakotah grew when residents there heard that Eufaula attorneys had obtained an injunction that kept the county records in the Foley building on Main Street. On a Sunday morning in early June of 1908, a rail crew in Chakotah prepared a special train, and roughly 25 armed men under former Deputy United States Marshal W. Frank Jones climbed aboard with rifles and revolvers. They rode south toward Eufaula with the clear purpose of seizing the records by force. The train stopped at the Eufaula depot around midday. Townspeople who had been walking home from church watched a column of armed men march up from the tracks, some heading toward the location of the county offices, and others taking positions near the main intersection where the Foley building stood. The raiders wore cartridge belts and carried their weapons in plain view. Deputy City Marshals Kelser and F.M. Woods walked out to meet the column at the corner of Foley Avenue and Main Street. Witnesses later recalled that Jones warned them to clear the street or face gunfire. The two local officers stepped back, then hurried off to sound the alarm. Within minutes, Eufaula men were arming themselves. Some brought their own guns, others took rifles and shotguns handed out from the stock of a nearby hardware store. The quiet Sunday streets filled with the hard shouts of men taking cover behind watering troughs and hitching posts as the two groups faced each other across the intersection. The first man to fall that day was one of Eufaula's own officers. Special Deputy Sheriff Joe Parmenter, who had come to support the Chakotah party, opened fire and struck Marshal Woods several times. Woods went down with fatal wounds. Other shots followed. Parmenter himself took bullets as he tried to reach cover. Horses reared in the street. Glass broke in windows above the stores. For several chaotic minutes, the intersection at Foley and Main Street became a tight killing ground, and the question of the county seat hung on the outcome of a gunfight raging in the middle of town. Someone in Eufaula sent an urgent message out to Johnson's home, which stood a short distance outside town. The rider or runner carried a clear request. The city needed the black policeman who had spent years as a deputy marshal and who knew how to step into a violent standoff without losing his head. Johnson saddled his horse and rode in from his place, toward the sounds and smoke rising above Main Street. When he reached the center of town, he saw armed men from Chakotah still grouped near the courthouse offices and Eufaula men positioned along the street and in nearby buildings. The fight had paused, but the tension sat heavy on everyone there. Jones had worked with Johnson when both men had carried federal commissions. They had served as deputies during the hardest years of the Indian Territory courts. That shared history gave Johnson a narrow path to avoid more bloodshed. He moved through the Eufaula lines and called out to Jones by name. Witnesses later said that he did not raise his voice in anger. He spoke with the steady authority of a man who had arrested killers, bootleggers, and train robbers across the territory and had survived the work. He told Jones to lay down arms and end the raid. Jones could see that his men were now outnumbered and cut off, and that further shooting in the center of town would only bring more bodies to the street. The men from Chakotah were not eager to surrender. Jones had to speak with them one after another, persuading them that the fight was lost. Johnson remained where he could see the whole scene, watching weapons being lowered and held out. After hours of tension, the raiders gave up the county records they had seized and accepted custody. Eufaula men escorted them back toward the depot. By evening, the same rails that had delivered the armed squad carried them away as prisoners. 2 men lay dead and several were wounded, but the arrival of Grant Johnson and his use of his standing with Jones had stopped the battle from claiming more lives in the heart of Eufaula. That county seat war continued in courtrooms and at the ballot box, with one more special election held in February 1909 that finally confirmed Eufaula as the permanent county seat. Johnson's part in the struggle had been confined to that Sunday when he rode in from his home and used his reputation to end a street battle. Afterward, he returned to his regular rounds as a city policeman. He patrolled the black district of Eufaula, checked on the small businesses that stood along its unpaved streets, and watched for bootleggers and drunks who carried knives or pistols. Residents saw him walking past their houses late at night while oil lamps still burned in front windows. As the years moved into the 19-teens, the old federal court era faded. The Fort Smith gallows stood quiet. The Muskogee court no longer sent deputy marshals into the Creek Nation in the same way. State and county officers took on more of the work that Johnson and his colleagues had once done across the open territory. In Eufaula, the former deputy remained a figure of authority, but his beat narrowed to the streets of his own town. During these years, his son put on a uniform of his own, serving as a staff sergeant in the United States Army during the World War, carrying the family's sense of duty into a different kind of service overseas while his father continued to walk the alleys and storefronts at home. Old-timers in Eufaula did not forget what Johnson had done before he took the town job. Some had seen him ride out with Bass Reeves or Bud Ledbetter. Others had watched him bring prisoners in on the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas trains, ironed to the rail seats for the trip to court. When they spoke of the past, they mentioned how many men he had arrested, how he had gone into hard places such as Younger Bend, and how newspaper writers across Indian Territory and neighboring states had followed his work. When conflicts arose in the black community or trouble threatened at public gatherings, his presence still carried enough weight to quiet arguments before they sharpened into violence. He lived long enough to see Eufaula's courthouse district change again. In the middle 1920s, a fire destroyed the old courthouse that had been at the center of the county seat struggle, and a new brick courthouse rose in 1927 on the same ground, a sign that the county's institutions had settled into permanent form. By that time, Johnson was an aging man. The years of riding long circuits, chasing armed men, and walking night patrols had taken their toll on his body. But he remained a respected figure in town, recognized by both black and white citizens who knew his history. In early April 1929, his long career and long life came to an end in Eufaula. He died on April 9th in the town he had served for so many years. His body was buried nearby, and the local paper marked his passing with strong words, calling him one of the best peace officers the region had ever known, and urging younger African Americans in Oklahoma to study his record as both officer and citizen. The editorial writers noted that he had been brave, that he had not abused prisoners, and that he had done his duty in the hardest days of the Indian Territory, without stepping outside the law he was sworn to enforce. By then, the Old West era had closed, but the stories told in Eufaula, Muskogee, Fort Smith, and other towns preserved his place in it. Citizens remembered the small details, such as his wide-brimmed white hat, the black bandana at his neck, the pair of revolvers at his belt, and the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. They also recalled the larger record, the long list of men he had brought in alive, the few he had killed when they forced his hand, and the order he had helped impose on a region that had once seemed beyond the reach of law. In those recollections, and in the surviving accounts written during his lifetime and just after his death, Grant Johnson remained the fearless black deputy whose work astonished outlaws and fellow officers alike, and whose calm force as a policeman in Eufaula carried his legend into the quieter years after the frontier.